My guest today is Kilian Kleinschmidt. Originally from Germany, he currently lives in Tunisia. His bio reads like a romp through the world's most troubled spots, his 30-year career having taken him to some 20 countries across Europe, Africa, and Asia. From Uganda to Ukraine, from Pakistan to Congo, and wars and countless disasters in between. He has advised many governments and managed many United Nations programs. Welcome, Kylian. Now, Kylian, you made a successful career out of the misfortune of others, and humanitarians are often accused of becoming experts in human misery and profiting from it. How do you feel about having built your evidently successful career and livelihood on that basis? Has it been worth it?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mukesh, for having me. And I think this is really a very relevant question because, I left the system, I left the humanitarian disaster world about 10 years ago on my free will because I exactly didn't feel comfortable anymore. I didn't feel comfortable with what I felt had become sort of yes, there is another emergency, and yes, let's rush supplies and our people and our teams and put our flag there first, and in competition between agencies, organizations, volunteers, God knows who. So what we call today the humanitarian industry. So I must say, yes, I definitely sort of feel not guilty, but I feel that I've been part of something what had lost its soul over the years. And all that sort of transformed into a highly bureaucratic, actually transactional system where it's about caseloads, budgets, and spending authorities,
Now, you
etc.
used a very interesting phrase, your soul. And I'm sure you must have been heartbroken at many times observing and being part of circumstances. And, you and I have served in the same countries, and I think we share a lot in common. What do you do when your soul is shattered to keep the faith and keep going?
Well, there's always that sort of element. I'm saying, yes, I still make a difference. And I would like to recall one of my most, I would say, tricky, difficult, and frustrating missions, which was in 1997 being sent to what was then still Zaire, Eastern Zaire, with a mission to find and do something, rescue about 100,000 refugees from Rwanda in the rainforest. Now, realizing that these people had been, in fact, the ones who had perpetrated the genocide. And in fact, many of them were to be judged in tribunals and as basically mass murderers. And of course, it was together with their families and sort of standing there in the rainforest. And out of the roughly 100,000 people, I can say about 25,000 have been basically killed in front of us. And there was one of these situations where, well, you have a humanitarian thrust. You are there because that's your mission, yet you're failing in completely doing what you're supposed to do, saving lives. In the same time, you're facing people you actually believe they are criminals and have to be brought to international justice and to the justice of their country. So we couldn't do it. We couldn't do it right, and we couldn't do it wrong. So we just did our job as humanitarians. Yet these images from those days will never go away from my worst nightmares. That was horror.
Now, Kylian, you spent a huge part of your professional life tackling the issues of migration, forced displacement, refugees, running camps, providing refugee support services in many countries around the world. And yet, we live in a time where refugees are more and more unwelcome and countries are putting up barriers everywhere. Do you think that managing forced migration in a systematic and humane manner is now a lost cause? Or are there some robust solutions that you would advocate for?
Well, people on the move, we are all people on the move. You and I, we all exist because our ancestors have been moving, have been either refugees, forced, tribal movements, whatnot. My two grandmothers actually originate from refugee movements. One came as part of the Protestant movements from southern France. The other one was kicked out with the family after the First World War from Alsace in France and fleeing to Germany. So first of all, we need to realize, and that in fact it does, despite all the negative narrative surrounding migration, is actually our survival. The fact that all our cities have been coming out of that urge to seek protection. In fact, our cities are something like refugee camps because people grouped around the castle, the church, the mosque, the temple to be safer against insecurity or bad living conditions on the countryside. Unfortunately, that whole issue has been weaponized, has been used increasingly in the game to win or lose elections. It has been used to undermine the neighbor in pushing populations. It has gained a very negative image. Now, the 8 billion people on Earth, on our planet, there will always be movement. We should be seeking to sort of enable all of us to migrate, to move, if we would like you and me, having the right passport, having the right sort of identity which is needed to cross a border. But we're not asking for total freedom of movement. We are asking for the liberty to go there where opportunities are, where you are needed, where, in fact, there is space. Are there revolutionary approaches to that? I'm afraid no. However, the first step is to realize that we all are descendants and we are the result of migration.
Now, survivors, especially the ones who are forcibly displaced, are entrepreneurs par excellence in order to survive, obviously. And you are, of course, an entrepreneur from the heart. I read somewhere from your bio that you started life as a roofer, and then I read somewhere that you also repaired an engine and a train in order to help some refugees to move along, and that's very enterprising. And now you're working more in the private sector. Can you tell us more about what you're doing in the private sector now, and what sort of solutions are there from private enterprise to restore our faith in humanity?
Well, I mean, let's be very, very clear. The charity requirements. I mean, there's about 350 million people in need of humanitarian aid currently, or so 350, 400 million, and in fact, the money needed for that isn't sufficient. But what does it mean? I mean, there is a part of life-saving measures. And a lot of this has to do with accessing livelihoods. What means livelihoods? It means jobs. It means being able to cater for yourself. It's being able to make decisions and not to be completely sort of driven by others. And there, the private sector has the real means. And there is a very interesting sort of look into history required here. Why do we have public transportation? I mean, I'm simplifying here. Why do we have public transportation? Why do we have social housing? Why do we have even dispensaries and clinics? Because, in fact, the early capitalists at some point discovered it doesn't help when the people are dying. I mean, we have had in Germany, in the Middle Age, the Fugger in Augsburg basically established the first social housing schemes because they couldn't afford the dying workers in the textile industries. Moving from there into recognizing private sector means also initiative. Let's look at the current challenges, for instance, the African continent is facing. One is massive urbanization. There will be another sort of 2 billion people or so moving in the next 30 years into cities in Africa. Who's going to respond to that? It's entrepreneurship. It's expanding city capacity, municipal capacities, services, utilities. And that can't and is difficult to be handled only by the public sector. And secondly, for instance, energy. And the World Bank and the African Development Bank have recently, together with the Rockefeller Foundation, held a summit in Tanzania, Mission 300, bringing 300 million people on the continent to have access to energy, grid and off-grid. Who is going to do that? It's private sector, renewable energy companies. For instance, I'm now part of one of those companies. What does it mean? It means investing in provision of energy and at the same time what we call corporate social responsibility or shared values, investing in those areas. Private companies can become a major player in working together with the public sector, hand in hand, and the communities themselves, and everybody will win. It's a win-win-win situation for all parties. And that's, I think, is the only chance. You like it or you don't like it. But through charity, it's not going to happen.
Kylian, as humanitarians, we are brought up on the idea of selfless service to help others simply because there is a need. But today we live in a very difficult world where people are suffering all over the place, including in rich countries. So, how would you convince someone who says, look, I've got a family to feed, I'm losing my job, inflation is going up, and why should I help strangers in a foreign land when I myself are suffering, my children are suffering? Why should I care for others?
Well, I think it has become actually easier to defend that point because all of us can be hit by an emergency at any moment these days. We have seen horrible images of fires, of floods, of people drowning in Spain, flooding in civilized, highly developed environments, and suddenly you see thousands of cars floating around. I remember having been part of an initiative in Austria where I lived for a while, pushing for sort of preparedness and an initiative on climate change activities and prevention. And people were saying, but this is never going to happen to us. And of course it did happen, and floods and other disasters struck them. So it can hit me at any moment. That's the number one. And I will require solidarity, empathy, and support at that very moment. Now, I do agree that we can sort of reassure people and say, well, yes, that's about emergency life-saving support and putting people back on their feet so that they can carry on with their lives and restart a life. However, in the long term, there is other things which have to be put in place. So it's not your tax dollars which are going to be put, or euros, which are going to be put in some far-flung area somewhere else on the planet. But here, yes, let's work on exchange. And I would like to give you, and maybe it's not humanitarian in this sense, but it gives you an idea of what we can do today. I mean, we have technology. It's amazing. I happen to work in a little village and live in a little village in southern Tunisia, abandoned village with cave dwellings and really very primitive in the desert, arid areas. And it's fantastic. It's an environment brilliant for all sorts of activities, but it's not used, it's not utilized. And at some point, I connected that village with a business school in the Netherlands and Belgium. And there were suddenly business students, zooming in on that Berber village in southern Tunisia, looking at it and initially saying, my God, well, there's nothing. And as they were deep diving into that little village, they became fascinated and they saw all the opportunities and came up with a fantastic business plan of how that village could actually develop into something else. And it didn't need that much. And here again, we're talking about that fascinating capacities we would have and can have today of connecting such places, the unseen places on earth, with there where we have maybe already learned, we have made experiences, best practice, worst practice. We bring that together and it's a collective effort and everybody again will enjoy it. These business students enjoy it. Now, all what would it need is a little trigger to move them to the next stage. That's what we were trying. And then unfortunately, the initial financing was difficult to obtain. But that's how it should go.
So creating, I think you put it well. I think it's our challenge is to create that mutual sense of belonging and mutual empathy, because all of us are in one common boat. And we can help each other, because if we don't help the others today, perhaps tomorrow when we need help, there may be no one there to help us. So, Kylian, it's really heartwarming, isn't it, that despite the cynical times we live in, actually humanitarianism is far from dead. The spirit of humanitarianism, the desire to help another in distress, is alive and well, beating in hearts and minds around the world. And the question then is how to organize that in an efficient way without taking away the individual's agency to do good wherever they are, in whatever way they can find satisfaction and ability to reach out to others.
There are many ways of doing this. Yes, I do agree. I think that unfortunately, most of us are still believing in that concept of sharing. Most of us haven't lost it, despite being under attack for being sort of naive and whatever by, let's say, evil forces who are trying to stop that. The narratives which are against the poor, narratives against the migrants, narratives against people. But I think most of us will always share. But yes, we want to share in a different way. Why should we still share after the Second World War with the care packages which were distributed in Europe? And that was basically the beginning of that modern humanitarian aid as we know it. Cash transfers have become something which has been worked on extensively. But I mean, I remember in Pakistan in 2009 and 2010, when I served there, the government of Pakistan actually, during a major crisis, introduced, with my sort of personal help, the first cash transfers and using debit cards. That was much more useful than providing aid in kind, because people run into debt when they get displaced and in trouble, spending a lot of money. At that time, 400,000 or so families were helped with cash debit cards loaded with $300 by the government of Pakistan. Super efficient. A year later, the biggest floods, the first, let's say, big climate crisis hit over 10 million people in Pakistan, and 1.5 million families needed support. Again, 1.5 million families received debit cards. Now, the humanitarian systems didn't like it. I was deputy special envoy at the time to Pakistan for assistance, but and I said that's fantastic. But the humanitarian world said no, it's bad. There's no accountability. But people were happy because they could take care of themselves. I mean, would they buy a tent? No, there were maybe a piece of plastic sheet in the shop. Yes, there were families cut off from any, let's say, commercial systems, but that was only a smaller portion. So, I mean, there are ways of doing this differently. It has been tried as well in terms of poverty reduction. It has been tried. Cash transfers is one way. People feel maybe more comfortable with some of that. That direct collaboration between human beings. And again, here we're talking about over 3 continents, even in that particular podcast now. It's possible to have a direct human contact backed up by technology. The technology is not all. And that's the beauty of tailoring it to the way of how I want to contribute. I can contribute with knowledge. I can contribute with money. I can contribute with some extra items I have, which I put into some pipeline I trust. So all of that is very doable in a very interconnected world. And let's use that in an intelligent way. But it's not only about money. It's a lot about knowledge. For people who help you to tie up your project. When you try to set up a business somewhere in Chad or whatever, in Western Sahara or wherever, you can find someone who will help and do your business plan.
I am impressed by your stubborn optimism, considering the terrible world we are currently living in. And perhaps that's a suitable moment to end. So thank you, Kylian, for joining me today and sharing your reflections and perspectives. I'm sure that's given our listeners some food for thought and perhaps even challenged them a bit. And to you, dear listeners, thanks for being with us. And I hope you can join me, Mukesh Kapila, again in the near future. Thank you all.